right. All right, so for our final panel, we're going to have Adam comment, and then we'll open it up for conversation, discussion, debate. So Adam Tooze is Catherine and Shelby Cullen Davis Professor of History at Columbia University, where he teaches and researches widely in the fields of 20th century and contemporary history, with a wide range of themes in political, intellectual, military history across the canvas, stretching from Europe across the Atlantic, on topics ranging from the making of economic knowledge in early 20th century Germany to the history of the global financial crisis. He's written for the London Review of Books, New Left Review, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and Foreign Policy. Is the author of many articles and books, including The Deluge, The Great War, and the Remaking of the Global Order, 1916 to 1931, and most recently, Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World.
Thank you very much for, I'm sure like everyone else here, I'm extremely grateful to you for organising this panel. I should say, though, that when you first approached me about it, I hesitated. And I think I agreed to come along in part because you shared with me your skepticism about the populism meme, which has been such a dominant factor in public discourse in recent years. Without wanting to be self-aggrandizing, I'd like to give you just a few minutes of the experience of having published a book about the financial crisis of 2008 for the anniversary of 2018, which was a deliberate move, obviously, to attract attention. But I don't think I understood the implications of this. I ended up last fall doing interviews with newspapers and radio and television outlets from 25 countries around the world, so every single major media system in all of the major languages, including the Asian, Latin American, the African continent is probably the only part of the world in which I wasn't dealing with interviews. And why this is relevant is that in every single one of probably 100 to 150 separate encounters, the question of populism was put in so many words. Despite the fact that in my book I studiously avoid using the term, I was forced over and over again by the media spontaneously, without my provocation, to address this question of populism. So the first thing I'd like actually to put up for discussion, and it follows directly from our fascinating exchanges this morning, is the phenomenon of this global discourse. It strikes me as interesting, as a fact, that literally every major media system in the world has a question about that to the next best talking head academic they can find, who happened to be me last fall. In one sense, because of Trump's antics and the amount of time and headspace they consume, it's a sort of perverse reassertion of American centricity, perhaps at the moment of its degenerate final conclusion, perhaps not. But what I think is also really interesting about it is the flatness of this discourse. In other words, the fact that the President of the United States is frequently and promiscuously compared to, take your pick, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Modi, the Hungarian Prime Minister. There's an extraordinary kind of space of comparison that's been established, which, again, I think is quite unusual, and perhaps it's even more unusual that the American president himself seems willing to endorse this. In other words, he doesn't demand for himself an exceptionalism, he's willingly thrown himself into this comparative space. And we know, and we talked a little bit this morning about the political styles and obvious imitations that we can see, and this is an interesting phenomenon. Historically, one's tempted to say it goes back, well, that's, I think, an interesting question. When do we see these kind of collective resonances of political style globally? It's also produced a remarkable, I mean, in many ways deeply frustrating, but nevertheless really quite remarkable global conversation about the winners and losers of globalization, structural change. Again, a whole variety of really strongly analogizing and comparative discourses have been produced in which, you know, people in the marginalized, not suburbs, because those are people of color in France, but the deindustrializing regions, for instance, of northern France are compared to the Rust Belt of Pennsylvania, are compared to the north of England, comparisons which are not common in global media discourse have become quite prevalent. And that seems to me to point to the fact that this conversation about global politics, which I think may constitute a novelty, in the sense that never before have we attempted to read the global political scene in quite this kind of way, perhaps outside moments of revolution. Is itself dependent on and parasitic on a pre-existing discourse of globalization, which is the common shock which everyone, the Brazilians, the Indians, everyone is exposed to in some sense. And it feeds another phenomenon, which I think we have to take quite seriously, which is the talk of the global right turn as the result of conspiracy, of deliberate manipulation, and of course this centers on the figure of Putin. Lisa, just in passing, said, well, that's a contingent factor. What I find really striking about this discourse is it's treated as absolutely non-contingent by extremely serious, by some people like Tim Snyder, who are making a kind of career out of this, but also by extremely serious political actors in the EU, for instance, regard themselves as under almost continuous attack by Russian trolling. I mean, at the very top level of European politics, this is actually a deeply established conviction. And it's seen in that sense as it's not contingent, it's structural in the sense that it's a new Cold War kind of phenomenon. In other words, the Russians are just doing what you would expect Russians to do, and we should expect them to go on doing this in future. And I think that's a remarkable phenomenon of this moment. If you ask where this global narrative goes back to, not what its structural conditions are, but what chronologically its origin is, I would tend to think that, like Philip, in these fascinating remarks, and also in his absolutely brilliant book, which if you haven't read it, you really should, on the 1989, I think it does have to go back to 1989 and the Annus Mirabilis of 1989. If there's a moment where, as it were, the global political clocks are all simultaneously reset in the minds of the global commentariat, I think it's 1989. This is the moment around which the idea of the third wave of democracy is constructed. And I don't want to question this fundamentally. I think that would be absurd in various ways. And like Philip, I'm a 1989er too. I was on the demonstrations in East Germany in that year. The sense of liberation was palpable, as was the sense of risk in Leipzig in the fall of 1989. But I think the thing that one immediately wants to add, and in this sense I'm echoing so much of what my historian colleagues were saying this morning, is that the idea which is so powerful, of an unproblematic synthesis of three elements: democracy, liberalism, as understood, say, by the European Union, as a catalogue of rights, rule of law, human rights, and so on, and global capitalism, a synthesis which no longer had to rely on the complex hegemonic trade-offs of the social democratic moment of the 1950s and 60s. That idea, powerful as it was and is, was a fantasy, an extraordinary fantasy, in fact, totally at odds with previous historical experience that those three things could go together. There aren't many moments in European or anyone else's political theory when anyone thought that democracy and liberalism went together, because they clearly don't. Let alone the idea that democracy, liberalism, and a massively concentrated structure of ownership and power. Why did we, there are countries like America which have kidded themselves for hundreds of years about this, but to the amazement of everyone outside. But it's that fantasy which is now under threat, I think, and in quite interesting and important ways. I think we have to understand both the bubble. We need to understand the bubble to understand it first. What happened? In 1989. It's worth recalling. If we shift the focus, why is it that we think that 1989 was as significant as it was? It's a Eurocentric, but it's an East European, Central European centric story, and it's a story which, as Philip shows, is extraordinarily ambiguous there in its consequences. Even more so in Western Europe. Another way of problematizing this story is actually to look at the political histories of the United States and the United Kingdom in this period, and as leaders will show. There's no reason to think of the late 80s as a moment of liberation in their political histories. On the contrary, right? It's a depressing extension of 1980s conservatism into the 1990s. In the German case, which you might think of as the sort of hub of this liberatory narrative, the effect of 1989 is to revive the career of what was thought of as a conservative dinosaur, Helmut Kohl, who was on his way out, and to postpone what then becomes the triumph of the Red-Green coalition until the late 1990s, who were seen as the dynamic forces of actual German democratization and progress, and in the meantime to unleash a wave of xenophobic violence which the Federal Republic had never previously had to deal with. All of this happening in the moment of the triumphs of this synthesis and the drumbeat of the end of history. The 1990s are the moment where anti-globalization politics in its modern form takes off across the world, focused on the WTO as the institution which has to be combated. Lisa, rather, I thought, timidly earlier on, was saying, well, I don't mean to be nostalgic for the Cold War, but it did allow some balance. If you take the most important historical synthesis of the 1990s, which is surely Eric Hobsbawm's Age of Extreme, it ends, if you remember, on an incredibly pessimistic note, precisely because the balance of the Cold War has ended, and what we're going to be faced with now is a series of small self-determining republics under the hegemony of global capital. That was the common sense of the left in the 90s. Critical discourse about inequality, the 1%, 99% discourse, which breaks out to the global public with Piketty after 2013, all of that statistical work begins 2 decades earlier. Piketty is simply the beneficiary of the publicity wave that, in fact, he's earning the harvest of work done by empirical social science, targeting the first wave of globalization in the 70s and 80s, and Atkinson is really the progenitor of that. But no one who grew up intellectually in the age of Thatcher or Reagan can really have been under any illusions about this. If Gramsci was the inspiration for left-wing intellectuals in the 70s and 80s, the key figure, and this picks up a theme in Philip's intervention of the 90s, well beyond the confines of the left, was Karl Polanyi. By the late 1990s, the central mainstream figures in global economic history, Williamson and Kevin O'Rourke on the one hand, Harold James at Princeton, are writing solidly Polanyian accounts. Harold James published a book in 2001 with the title The End of Globalization, which was not a prediction, it was a cautionary tale about how in the first wave of globalization had come to grief in the 1920s and 1930s, driven by the logic of excessive globalization, rising inequality, and nativist resistance against migration, right? And the whole point was to make this a universal story, because it didn't need the accidental quote-unquote factor of World War I to drive this. It was the internal logic of globalization success that would bring about this result. In Europe, the intense preoccupation with the falsity of the promises of modern democracy and their emptiness begins in the early 2000s. Philip, you mentioned the figure of Colin Crouch, whose book Post-Democracy has a huge impact on German debate, but you could also think of Rancière in France with his book The Hatred of Democracy. The thing which this centres around is the EU constitutional referendums of 2005, in which the French and the Dutch populations, coalitions of left and right-wing voters, very reminiscent of current political configurations, voted down the EU's constitution. And how did the EU respond? It decided to carry on relabeling, rebadging the constitution as the Lisbon Treaty, and in the Irish case, actually just running a series of referendums until they got the right result. So that sense of the emptiness of democracy's promise is palpable on the left in the early 2000s. As is, in the American case, the critique of the degeneration of the privatized media sphere. If you think back to the earlier generation, it's the shock jocks. It's not Facebook and Twitter, it's the shock jock generation of balkanized American radio system. And in Italy, we actually have the first master of this type of politics, Silvio Berlusconi, who is a far more original and dynamic figure, a true self-made billionaire, quite unlike Trump, who I think of as a very degenerate kind of imitation. We also, at that moment, and this picks up on a key point of Lisa's that I want to come back to at the end, we also begin to see the diagnosis, the critique, but also the vivid power of key sectional interest groups of capital and their ability to basically distort public communication about major issues, above all climate change. Climate change is not an issue of the present. Climate change is a story that begins in the 1990s as a global politics, and the mobilization against Exxon goes back to that moment. And that is the power politics which I think is still being played out in Trump's case. Take evangelicalism, which Sean brought up this morning. The moment of crisis, this may be something, a perception that one has, particularly as a Brit, dates to the early 2000s, where you see the crisis within the Anglican community, which is one of the most liberal globally of the established churches, and the extraordinary power politics in which conservative American congregations are affiliating to Nigerian branches of the Anglican Church so as to escape the pro-gay politics. In Uganda, likewise, the first wave of anti-gay mobilization is 2004-05. If the key issue of the present is the degeneration of the Republican Party, I mean, no one who lived consciously through the 1990s can be really under any illusions about the nature of that political organization at that moment. It's not clear, I think, that after Reagan, the Republicans accept the legitimacy of any Democratic president. They didn't accept Clinton, and they didn't accept Obama. Their politics is no longer that of a cooperative democratic politics. It's no longer agonistic it's agonistic in a radical sense, which is quite dramatic. So all of this is just building up to the point that I want to make, which I think is echoed through all of our conversations. It's a classic historian's point, but I think it's absolutely crucial, which is that if we today face a crisis of democracy, it's a crisis of democracy 2.0. There was one already. There was already a powerful crisis discourse. And that, for me, is crucial also then for reading my way through my own confusions about this language of shock and fear, which is so palpable in our current moment. Because though on the one hand I share this, on the other hand there's a bit of me which says, what am I shocked by? What am I fearful of? We've been living through this reality for decades, right? The idea somehow that there's a Trumpian deviation. And I think that's crucial also for understanding the sense to which, for many political actors in the current moment, significant voices that I do spend a lot of time listening to on the far left, the current moment isn't a crisis of American democracy. It's in fact a clarifying resolution of the opacity created by the Obama-Clinton dynasty. And it's a moment of extraordinary opportunity precisely because that veneer is off, and de facto it is in fact a mobilization on the left wing of the Democratic Party, the likes of which we've never seen before. The fact that socialism has lost its bad name for a large part of young Americans is a remarkable historical phenomenon. So that I think is crucial. But so what makes the division between the crisis of democracy 1.0 and the crisis of democracy 2.0? Well, it's the thing that I've spent far too much time talking about recently, which is the economic crisis of 2008. I think there's no doubt that marks a break. Let me say just a few things about that. At one level, it seems to me that the backlash against establishment politics in the wake of the 2008 crisis surely cannot be any surprise. I mean, what on earth did you think would happen after the astonishingly lopsided way in which that crisis resolved? If there's ever been a moment in which the American state served to articulate the elite interests of American capital, it was the fall of 2008, in a most transparent way imaginable. It's like an exercise in Marxist state theory of a kind of most elementary kind. It does produce a backlash, and the poster child for that is the case that Philip invoked this morning, which is Hungary. I mean, there's a sort of straight line through from Hungary sliding through the emerging market shock of 2008 into an IMF program, and this becomes then a sitting duck for Orban's nationalist mobilization, in which he very skillfully basically outplays the global institutions and expels the IMF, taking advantage of a global market situation in which anyone can borrow money, regardless of their politics. So it's really striking. But in these countless interviews I've had to do, I mean, I've felt increasingly uncomfortable about drawing straight lines. I mean, one crucial point to make is that across Europe, anyway, the response to 2008, and this is true in a sense in Brazil as well, that the response to 2008 in political terms was in fact incredibly varied. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that across a large part of southern Europe, which has been most severely hit by the recession, we've only recently, in the Spanish case, seen the emergence of a nationalist party, and the immediate beneficiaries was in fact the emergence of a vibrant new left-wing type of politics. Now that was not devoid of its patriotic elements or its nationalist elements, it's notably in the case of Syriza. But it's a remarkable phenomenon nevertheless. And Portugal today and Greece have left-wing governments of a stripe that we've not seen before really in European political history. The French and the British Labour parties / the entire political spectrum on the left in France lurched to the left. Again, in the French case, this, and arguably also in the case of Corbyn's Labour Party, this has a parochial nationalist dimension to it. Mélenchon is nothing if not anti-German in his political rhetoric. But it's a reality that we have to deal with. And certainly in the way in which the global media constructed the phenomenon of populism that someone had to explain to them, it wasn't the right. I mean, this is why in the end I think your title for this program is much more interesting, because it's squarely focused where the questions really ought to be, which is on the nationalist right. Whereas what we saw in the immediate moment was populism as a left-right thing, right? Where Syriza belonged in the Podemos belong in the same pot as the AFD and UKIP. But in the face of the doggedness and stupidity of the questions that I kept being asked, in which people would argue, well, how can the crisis be responsible for the surge of nationalism when in Norway you have a party, or in Finland you have a party, and these are affluent countries, and they've had nationalist upsurges at the same time as the politics in the United States and so on. It's forced me back to thinking that we do really need to go back, and in our conversation this morning that sense was emphasized, and in the sophistication of the answers that people were giving, I think we were mobilizing this, but we should try and make it explicit to ourselves. And Philip was insistent on bringing up this term, so there's a Marxist explanation. For me, what we need to do is we need to go back to the sophistication of Marxist critical theory and Marxist social theory, not because I want to advocate Marxism per se, but because it's a good method or set of things to think with and think against of the late 1970s and the 1980s. And the single best thing I did for my intellectual health in the last 6 months or so in a reading group at Columbia was to reread Policing the Crisis by Stuart Hall and the Birmingham Cultural Studies Collective, which came out in 1978, which is a classic melange of Althusserian and Gramscian elements trying to understand the mugging crisis, which is the street crime crisis epidemic of early 1970s Britain, in its complex and multiple determinations. And I think that, for me, is the kind of model of how we might go about thinking about this phenomenon that Paul has put on the agenda. What, very briefly, does that kind of approach give us? Well, first of all, it enables you to think of, say, the problem of protectionism, not as separate from and to be played against an explanation of Trump, which goes in terms of race or gender, but as intimately intertwined, because it's evident that the image of the working American man displaced by Mexican imports is a racialized and gendered object, which is a middle-aged burly bloke in a hard hat, right? Whereas we know that the reality of the American working class is people of color who are overwhelmingly women. And if you're interested in the hierarchies of inequality in the United States, that's what you need to focus on. So that kind of first generation radical cultural studies gives us the resources to disentangle what in the media sphere is an endemic playing of economic against cultural and racial elements, as though these could be counterposed. It also allows us to focus, as the Althusserians and the Gramscians predictably do, on the state structure itself and the effects of the restructuring of the state in shaping the political field. And this has emerged as crucial to understanding the logic, say, of Brexit, where it's evident that the Brexit vote swung most heavily, and this was the thing that Philip brought up, in the districts where, not where migration was highest, but where the austerity cuts were most severe. And so what that did was to amplify the sense of a resource competition, which was not a natural effect of migration, but a result of the austerity policy proceeding since 2010. This sort of analysis also leads you to focus on what, for me, I think is an absolutely key element of this on the right, which is to understand, and this is a classic Gramscian theme, ruptures of party structure, and the increasing inability of conservative elites to pull off the kind of coalitions and harnessings that were crucial to sustaining the drive to globalization in the 1980s and the 1990s. We forget too easily how controversial NAFTA was. It was incredibly difficult to get NAFTA through because it was opposed by the left wing of the Democrats and by the xenophobic right wing that was already crucial to the post-Southern strategy Republican Party. It depended on a cross-party alliance with both sides doing the work. Now that depends on you being able to harness both sides, and we can see this in the Brexit case classically. The Tory party since the 80s has been an accident waiting to happen because its xenophobic nationalist base is at odds with the globally orientated interests of the party elite. You see this in the CDU in Germany, which ever since the golden age of the Federal Republic has been an exercise in containing its far right wing. Franz Josef Strauss, the Bavarian Prime Minister of legend, was famous, apart from anything else, for announcing that there will be nothing to the right of us, right? Containing that vote on the right was crucial, and the ability of Merkel's CDU to do that disintegrated in the course of the Eurozone crisis. The AfD is not originally an anti-immigrant party, it's an anti-Mario Draghi party, or more specifically, a party aimed at undercutting Merkel's ability to do compromises to save the Eurozone at the expense of the German fiscal stability. And then the refugee crisis happens and their vote multiplies. But the most dramatic case of this is clearly in the United States itself. And for me, it goes back to 2008. I mean, counterposed to the elite synthesis that we see around the crisis fighting in 2008, the scene in the summer of that year is extraordinary, where you have a Republican administration unable to whip the majority of Republican votes in the House or the Senate in favor of the bailout of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These aren't investment banks. The Republicans don't love them, but they are core to the home ownership model in the United States, and they couldn't get the votes. The Republicans are the people who bring down TARP the first time round on the 29th of September 2008. That, to me, is the moment when Trump becomes possible, where the Republican Party, a large part of it, becomes more powerfully concerned with issues of identity, a kind of emotive politics, rather than the business of actually governing the United States in the interests of American capital and American property owners. And it's an extraordinary moment. From 2011 onwards, the Chamber of Commerce is selectively campaigning against Republican Party candidates across the United States if they belong to the Tea Party wing of the party. In 2016, the Chamber of Commerce refused to endorse Trump's candidacy for the American presidency. That summer, not a single American major corporate could be found to sponsor the Republicans' convention to nominate Trump. Why? Because their media advisors were too worried about the possibility of their corporate logos appearing next to Confederate flags. Right? That's the moment when your ability to square this kind of deal between your xenophobic base and your corporate interest just becomes a problem in that managerial sense. So this, to me, suggests, and this goes to the key point that Lisa was raising, I think, is like, how far is this a real crisis in the articulation of elite interest with popular support? I would wholeheartedly agree with the idea that we cannot let go of the fact that some people are really getting paid in this situation. You're gutting the EPA, you're pulling out of Paris. These are core interests. But I think no less dramatic is the assault on America's trade policy. And this is unambiguously problematic for a large number of key American corporate players. They stopped the push to repeal NAFTA in its tracks in the spring of 2017. Apparently the 100 days had been set at the moment when Trump was going to do this. They prevented him from doing that. But the cancellation of TPP and TTIP is really highly significant. And the China confrontation for corporations like Apple, we've not seen the fallout yet. But that is a shocking reversal of the interests. And America's the complicated case. Brexit's much more spectacular. There really isn't a substantial business interest in the United States that's aligned. So we really are seeing a rather remarkable disarticulation of elite interest with popular decision making. The question, I think, is how far this goes. And I want to end with something that Helmut and I were discussing earlier, and it's been touched on around the edges, and it's really the question of violence in this current moment. And how dramatic we think of this being as a key element in the politics of the radical right at this moment. Because there's no doubt, and it's been highlighted in the case of Brazil, it obviously plays a key role in Africa. The Germans have spent a large part of this summer arguing about whether in Chemnitz there actually was a manhunt. Yeah. Whether or not the video evidence of white Germans beating up foreigners constituted palpable evidence of a manhunt. Actually, this is the thing: manhunt or not, or maybe just a riot, not a manhunt. So, violence is key to this moment. But if you think back to the history of right-wing politics in its deeper history in Europe, anyway. What I don't see in our current configuration is the thing that's really constitutive and central to its ideology in the early 20th century, which is the idea really of a redemptive, sacrificial mass violence of total war and its implications. And to that extent, I don't know whether this makes me feel better about our current moment, but as a historian, I would want to insist on the specificity of our current moment. And it's perhaps a question for the radical right now, is like, what is your right-wing politics if it doesn't, in fact, involve the appeal to mothers and fathers to sacrifice their sons in some heroic national struggle? What kind of a politics is that? And that may be a specifically European question, which has a different resonance elsewhere, but that certainly in the European case is the thing that I pull back from. And that's, I think, what for me makes the confrontation with China in our current moment so worrying. Because not only does China sit on the outside as an abstract, as a model of how you could have different types of capitalism and authoritarian types, but increasingly, I think what's going on in the American security establishment is a questioning of the basic premise of the story that we're telling here, which is that they're not clear that they actually did fully win the Cold War in 1989. Because the other anniversary of this year is the Tiananmen Square massacre, which is when the Chinese regime announces whether we're paying attention in the West or not, their answer to that question is no, you haven't. And the fact that the American polity on both sides, with the Democrats involved as well, is waking up to this reality, and what they make of it, I think, is really the sort of most, I mean, that, if the absence of the total war syndrome in the European case is one defining feature of our situation, the fact that a geopolitical confrontation of that scale is something that can be calmly contemplated in American politics by a large segment of the political spectrum, is truly terrifying, I think. I mean, those were my comments on this one. It was very thought-provoking.
Thank you so much. Questions or comments? Let's do that, or should we just open it up? Should we just? We'll just start with questions, and it can just evolve into, yeah. Can I kick it off? I'll claim moderator's prerogative here. So on the question of violence, which I've also been very intrigued to think about the presence and the kind of absence of violence, and the kind of also the places where violence is practiced but invisible, or kind of not politically salient. And this goes back to Lisa's comment about the Cold War in a way, thinking about 89, 91, and kind of the pivot of the Cold War. One of the things that strikes me is to think about, in a way, a lot of our assumptions about sort of national welfarist political formation in the mid-20th century happening under what we could call a kind of rubric of governing by war, right, in which you have a kind of both a militarized kind of argument for amelioration of social inequality and the kind of interests of national power projection, right, in all kinds of ways, and that becomes the undergirding of the social democratic state, within the U.S. center, but also in its peripheries and its satellites, and kind of, so the Soviet Union provides, on the one hand, an important ideological competitor that's kind of clipping in very harsh ways the left wing of the possible in the United States, but also creating the kind of competitive drive for a politics of prosperity and kind of widely distributed economic equality, and that goes away, right, in ways that were anticipated as potentially undermining the possibilities of kind of progressive state praxis. But what happens, or at least one of the things I'm thinking about in that kind of post-89 moment is, the kind of internalization of the war, right? And the way that we can think about kind of a shift from a kind of formal rubric of governing through war to governing through crime, right? In which, crime is understood in terms of war, right? And so when you're looking for that frontier of violence, I would say that everyday urban municipalities in sort of, really in, across the world, and we see many examples of this, right? Police forces, encountering citizens and migrants, right? People with various different political standing, and understanding social order in terms of a kind of politics of internalized permanent warfare. So I just put that out there as sort of in terms of where is the violence in and thinking about what impact the end of the Cold War had in terms of both the identification of enemies that could be demonized, and also places where control would be exercised. I guess that's one place where I would find it.
I meant to say that. I was going to actually go in a slightly different direction, though. I like the way that you took it, but so there's another argument, isn't there, which is that the Great Compression, the welfarist deals of the trans World War II moment are conditional on logics of mobilization. And with the end of conscription-based militaries, with the end really of the possibility of that kind of war as a remotely realistic historical possibility, went also the possibility of imagining truly comprehensive systems of solidaristic resource mobilization. And various people have argued that also poses a sort of structural limit on the possibilities of any kind of progressive redistributive politics in the future, that resource is not there. Now, I'm tempted to think that might be a rather peculiar, that's the history of a certain set of societies. There are plenty of others which actually do have welfare states, which don't necessarily have that total war experience. But certainly thinking out from people like Piketty, that's been a tempting move for people to make. The compression coincides with total war experience. Your train of logic went in a slightly different direction, which is we haven't lost the violence so much as we've displaced it in ways which then reinforce inequality and segmentation. And again, I think that's very compelling in the US case. I mean, moving here in 2009 from the UK, that was the double shock. I mean, this was a society, we had troops in Iraq and Afghanistan too, but America was actually at war. Places like Yale Law School were worrying about it. And moving to a post-industrial, highly racialized city like New Haven, the other element of your argument was also manifest. In other words, you lived in a militarized security environment in a way that, coming from Britain, I'd never experienced before. And that isn't because the British state isn't capable of mobilizing violence. It doesn't do it in that way. And so I find that quite compelling, and that would surely add further to this sort of thoroughly disillusioned history of democracy and democratic crisis, which I would be wholly open to. I mean, you could push that more and more. There was another element I was struck by in the conversation earlier, where people were saying, well, there are these regimes now which hold elections and everyone knows how they're going to go. Well, the fact of the matter is that all the communist regimes did that. East Germany had regular elections, and everyone. In fact, there was a multiplicity of parties in the East German parliament, far more than there are in many of those systems today. So if that's the future, then 1989 really never happened. Right? if that's where we're going, then so I think these would be ways of really continuing that. The significance then, really, of the early 90s from the American point of view is the rehabilitation of the American military from the disillusioning, the truly shaking shock of Vietnam by way of the first Iraq War, which did more for the stability of conservative militarist power in the United States than I think the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was what enabled you to fight the war in Kuwait. But the Kuwait War is that's the shock, that's where you get the real drama. And that, even though spending levels go down, it hugely changes the position of the American military. And it's out of that machine then, in the wake of 2003-4, that we get this militarization by way of the SWAT teams and so on, and local police forces. So that sort of story seems very compelling to me. I would, however, emphasize that all of that is distinct again from the total war logics that people like Helmut and I have struggled to understand in places like Germany. I mean, the public slogan of the Hitler Youth movement, the one that was advertised to society, was, "I was born to die for Germany."
Yeah, that was similar in Japan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was born to die for Germany. That isn't a rhetoric which has much
Right, so the kind of violence you're talking about is different than the kind of violence
Yeah,
you're talking
yeah.
about.
I mean, the reason the United States can be constantly at war is because so
Very
few people
experienced.
die.
Yeah.
I mean, probably more high school
Well-
kids were killed in shootings last year than died.
And certainly
in-
by accidental
yeah,
discharges.
yeah,
So
yeah.
few people on the US side.
Yeah,
die.
exactly.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying the United States could be at war. I'm not talking about anybody else.
And I do think that-
Believe me, I know about the other side, that's it, but.
But that constitutes
yeah.
an interesting element in the Cold War, because at the high points of the Cold War, one did have to imagine the possibility that tens of millions of Americans would be destroyed by a Soviet nuclear weapon. So I think the Cold War, to that extent, is a really genuinely shaking moment.
Yeah, and I just checked, just because I wanted to, but the police in Brazil killed more people last year, and that's only the people who were registered as killed by the police. So it was 5,144 officially killed by the police. Certainly more than that were killed, and that's more than all the U.S. citizens killed in the Iraq War. So,
Yes.
and the entire Iraq
Yes.
War.
Yes.
So, I mean, the degree of police violence in certain parts of the globe, so not just a police presence, because really what you're talking about, even in New Haven, is a police presence, first and
Yes.
foremost. What we're talking about in places like Brazil
Active.
or much of Africa is police killings. Yeah, so that's a very sobering thing to think about. But I also wanted to say, in terms of like 1989 never happening, so a lot of people that I've talked to about it in retrospect say, well, really what it was about was mobility, was being
Yes.
able to move. And of course, then that's also ironic, because of course now what we're trying to do is, or what various groups are trying to do, is shut down mobility. And so yet another way in which it, you know.
I do not want to be misunderstood. I meant quite sincerely, like, of course it happened.
Yeah.
But I think the question is whether what happened is this sort of metaphysical,
Yeah.
perfect solution of
Yeah.
all our bourgeois dreams at once. You know?
Yeah, and of course there would never be perfect mobility, but the idea that mobility meant so much, and now we're so focused on the issue of who can be mobile and who can't. So I think it's more a source of irony than literal.
Thanks, Adam. This was a real tour de force. I do want to come back to 1989, and the thing that we almost forget about 1989 is that in France there was another statement being made about it, and that was that it was essentially the end of 1789. You know, Fouret's Pensée de la Révolution, and their part of that idea was that it was the end of the salience of this left-right distinction, which was forged in the National Assembly. And I wonder, in your comments, you do seem to lean to the notion that it's important to separate out right-wing nationalism, and perhaps I'm not interpreting you right here, but it's important to separate out the right from the left. And yet there are still so much of this that seems has very similar trajectories. I mean, when I think about the politics of someone like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, it looks a lot like right-wing politics, only different because of the question of poverty. So I just wondered if you want to address this one time.
That's a really... So, I mean, my short answer is yes, I'm extraordinarily suspicious of the convergence kind of discourse. I mean, it's so transparently ideological in its effects. I mean, that doesn't mean that in detail it may not be useful to make comparisons and to establish parallels, but a sort of blanket convergence story, I find just, yes, it makes me suspicious. But the setup of your question is so complicated, and I'm struggling to because the story that the story I'm really sympathetic to is the one that Philip was outlining, and it revolves around this term which doesn't play the same role in American discourse as it does in Europe. But Tina, right, is the key term. So Margaret Thatcher's "there is no alternative," generalised by way of the German efforts to constitutionalise the basic elements of a social and economic order in the constitution, not only of their own country but that of the EU at large. That then spiralling forward through to the moment in the Eurozone's crisis where somebody like Wolfgang Schäuble could openly say to the Greek government, sure, you can have an election, but you have to understand that it doesn't matter which way you vote. Openly, in a public forum in which the Europeans are discussing. So so for me, the Fourier moment of 1989 stands for that duality in which, as it were, we declare the universal victory of democracy and simultaneously declare the substantive irrelevance of any possible.
Oh, but Schäuble, it's no wonder.
Yeah, no, but it is no wonder, and it's not entirely, well, it's a complicated story even in his case, but given his power, it matters, and it's an extreme and polemical overstatement of the point, however, which I think for me goes back to that 1989 moment in which you have that extraordinary duality. And because of the extremity of American party politics and its polarization and the way in which institutions like the Supreme Court are themselves partisan political, that logic, is pretty difficult to convince. I mean, somebody like Alan Greenspan at the absolute high point of the kind of market consensus will say it doesn't matter which way I vote in 2008 because the markets will dictate that. And if you follow that French discourse through, what's really fascinating is the role then of folks like Rosanne Ballon and that entire ultra-sophisticated post-Marxist discourse about democracy, which by the early 2000s has the effect in the global political theory scene of being able to even incorporate. So in the face of somebody like Rancière or Colin Crouch, who from the left in Europe is saying, well, look, democracy has been evacuated of all content, someone like Rosanne Ballon will come along and say, and that's exactly what people have said in the history of French democracy, more or less all the way back to the day after the 14th of July, 1789, right? Okay. On the 15th, they were already complaining about the fact that it wasn't as exciting as storming the Bastille the day before, right? And ever since, democratic politics has been a story of disappointment. So, Colin Crouch and Jacques Rancière, hold your horses, you're all just, your language is just the language of disillusionment, which any mature person has to accept as what the nature of democracy is, right? That's where this goes. And again, this is why I think of this as, crisis of democracy 2.0. It's precisely those people, like the Rosanne Ballons of this world, 15 years later, who are declaring the emergency, the populist emergency. They've lost their own self-conscious calmness, right? As the balance of the argument has shifted. So that to me is no longer a fixed point, that 1989 Fourier moment, but itself in play in this conversation that we're having right now. And I would agree also, Schäuble serves as it's clearly, when he says that democracy doesn't matter, it's not true. It's not even true in Greece, right? But it's a weapon in this argument.
Like to invite you to engage in a quick thought experiment. Because sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Brexit hadn't happened, or if 2016 Hillary had won by a narrow margin. Yeah. And sometimes it almost seems even scary. I was thinking today actually, because it's hard to make the argument that things could be worse because people's lives have been damaged irreparably by this administration. But I wonder what condition would be now if this hadn't happened. Would it be in some ways even worse? Is it the fact that now populism is out in the open? Will it eventually debunk it and show that it's a scam in some ways, or because of the media that we live in, will it still have its validity?
No, I completely agree with this, and this goes back to the contingency that Paul was invoking at the beginning. I'm convinced that the New York Review of Books and the New York Times would not be in any kind of state of alarm whatsoever. If Hillary had won, we'd be in complacency central. Everything would just be fine. I mean, why would anyone be worrying about anything? The fact that we would probably, extraordinarily high probability still be heading towards a confrontation with China. Extraordinarily high probability that Congress would not have passed either TPP or TTIP. Very little prospect of any substantial action on climate change. No doubt abusive treatment of illegal, whatever we're going to call them, migrants on America's southern border, and the same in the EU. That for me is that's what animates my sympathy with the far left, who kind of keep their cool under this situation and just say situation normal, all fucked up. Like, what are you centrist? Well, for them, it's just like, you were telling us not to worry 10 years ago, and now you're all in a fluff. And like, and the situation is, of course, completely unsustainable on a variety of different metrics. Really, from this halcyon period of like globalization when everything fit together, never really existed in that sense. So that would be my reaction. It does indeed depend. Well, the political discourse and the extraordinarily feverish debate is highly contingent on those kind of outcomes. It's not obvious to me that it makes very much difference to racialized inequality in the United States one way or the other, given the nature of the Clinton. Now, does that make me a total fatalist? No. The 2016 election was astonishing. I mean, and the most astonishing thing about it is not Trump. The most astonishing thing about it is clearly Sanders. I mean, the fact that that guy could run Clinton even remotely close is mind-boggling in terms of America's recent political history. I mean, truly astonishing. Right? Okay, fine, the stuff I was citing about the Chamber of Commerce disowning the Republican candidate and no one being willing to sponsor their convention, that's pretty remarkable too. But yeah, that's, I think, the sense that I have. And of course, the difference is the Democratic Party proved to be better at shutting down the challenge from the left that they faced, which was, like the challenge from Trump, a fairly direct result, I think, of 2008 and Occupy. They proved better at stabilizing it. So the point this points towards is that our sense, the mainstream sense of normality, is conditioned on an extraordinarily high-stakes stabilization effort on the part of that side of the political spectrum. And the shock that we're currently experiencing is really the failure of the other side of the political spectrum to be able to successfully play that game. And then you're left in this weird situation where the Democrats end up as the only people responsible for kind of rational politics, which is a horrible place. I mean, it's a bad spot to be in. And the crunch issues are going to be stuff like fiscal politics, which where a large part of the Democratic Party is tempted by an utterly breathtaking, in the face of the evidence fiscal conservatism, which they have done. This will be the third time round, and every single time they get screwed, and there's nothing. And the left wing of the party is in love with MMT, which allows respectable commentators to carry on an argument about whether chunks of the Democratic Party endorse Zimbabwean or Venezuelan style hyperinflation. I mean, so yeah. I mean, it's not clear whether the American political system really has. Another way of reading this would be, and to generalize, is that the crisis we're experiencing is what happens when those boundaries break down, right? And in the American case, you end up with this Trumpiest discourse on the right and this anguished centrism versus extreme, not extreme, MMTism, but on the other. And in the German case, which is the sort of calmer version, a six-fold division of the party spectrum into a series of instantly legible, discrete, socio-political and economic milieu. And the German political system so far has proved capable. I mean, Lisa was being very kind to the German political system. I'm not sure I see it in quite such, and the site is really uncomfortably close to the New York Times in its politics and intellectual range. But the German political system, at least, has proved capable of absorbing that differentiation in an interesting way. But that, I like the force of your thought experiment is significant. The short answer, I don't think we would be having the panic discourse at all.
So I have a quick thing and then a question. Just we were talking about like the police violence before. Fun fact, not or horrifying fact. We have no idea how many police killings there are in America.
Yeah.
If anyone knows, right? Because there are no federal statistics on it.
The
So-
Guardian had to do an account, didn't they?
Yeah. And it's almost impossible to find out. So I thought it was crazy. You found the Brazilian stats
Yeah,
so
I
quickly.
just Google. I mean, I knew approximately how many it was, but I immediately Googled what they
Yeah,
know.
like
You know,
people-
but my husband's a sociologist of crime and deviance, and he knows he gets all. It's not that hard, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I'm sorry to say, it's actually easier to get that data than because
Yeah.
he's constantly showing me what the data is.
Yeah,
So
just
that's not
reporting
that
is so
hard.
uneven, right? It's so and don't like the law's not fine anyway.
So what are the numbers in the US? How many did
Yeah,
the
what are the
American
numbers?
police?
Yeah, that I don't remember, but it's not anything close to the Brazilian numbers.
But like the FBI doesn't track it, the CDC doesn't track it. Like any of the places that would normally track it aren't allowed to because of
Yeah,
repression.
but yeah, the CDC can't do any
No.
research on gunshot wounds as a health
Yeah.
problem. That is actually,
Yeah.
literally banned in its
Yeah.
mandate.
We definitely have a municipal
Yeah.
policing system. Anyway, just interesting. I want to talk about Vladimir Putin. Why not, right? We had a visit from Michael McFall on Wednesday, there, right? The U.S. former ambassador to Russia. He gave a talk in this class I'm a TA in, and I had a few issues with his talk and his politics, but he, is a guy who literally has met Putin. He's like confronted him a bunch of times. He's on a sanctions list. Like if he ever travels to Russia, he's gone to prison. So he has some kind of knowledge, personal knowledge, and he posited that Putin imagines the world in a bipolar way, right? And whereas it used to be the Cold War, he keeps that bipolarity, but instead it's on the one side there's cosmopolitan, weak Democrats, and on the other side, his side, are authoritarian protectionist politicians, right? Or nations. And so it's not really, it seems to me that that's not really like an ideology as much as like power politics, right? Or like crass power politics. And I'm just wondering, I'm not sure if this is a question for you or kind of for everyone, but if that is perhaps even like more insidious than ideology or more dangerous, more potentially destabilizing for democracy or the good government in nations, because it's not really presenting an ideological approach. It's just saying do whatever you can to achieve certain goals. Hacking, violence, do whatever as long as it achieves it. And so kind of the difference between power politics and ideology, and maybe the differences between a kind of pre-Cold War moment and this moment we find ourselves in now, if that's the big bipolar.
Again, I wouldn't want to be misunderstood as saying that I don't think that the Russians, dabble in interference in other people's elections. I think what's more interesting is the fact that to track the way in which Western observers are processing that fact, and the extraordinary emphasis that certain groups place on that one variable as a driver of outcomes. And there's a perverse interaction between the sheer contingency of the things that we've seen, in other words, these 1% swings, and then even very small effects can have huge effects because they just need to be responsible for swapping 1%. So it's I think that state of uncertainty about macro and micro effects, causal logics, is a very interesting situation that we're in. But again, coming out of a having spent a lot of time reading leftist critiques of the functioning of capitalism, this is a problem that all critical theories have always faced, in the sense that we've always been vulnerable to the accusation of using a conspiracy theory. And the extraordinary thing about our current moment is that there is no other way of describing the 13th of October 2008 other than as a meeting of the heads of all of the American banking system with the heads of the American government apparatus, one of whom is a former CEO of Goldman Sachs. But for the big fat cigars, which would have been present in an Eisenstein picture, it is the Eisenstein picture. So, what do we do? That is our current moment. And so now you have very bright, deep, serious people deeply committed to this kind of conspiratorial logic. I'm not sure, though, that I would make a categorical distinction, though, the one that you're making of it. I like the kind of counterintuitive logic. In other words, ideology is less dangerous than just a blank, power politics. It seems to me it is an ideology, and I don't mean that in the sense that I really believe the Tim Snyder version in which Putin is acting out some Slavophile. But I think he is, he's deeply imbued with Russian nationalism, and I don't think we should discount that at all. He's acting out the trauma of the 1990s. Anyone who doesn't take that seriously is not going to be able to predict his actions. He has a domestic political scene to contend with, which is not like ours, but is nevertheless a significant force. In other words, he needs not to be humiliated in public actions. And the West has systematically ignored this fact and acted as though our construction of the future order of Eastern Europe is going to be the one that's going to prevail, and has done so without the necessary backing of force and economic resource that would actually intimidate the Russians into complying. And so they play the game that you would expect. I think the ideologies that inspire the EU's conception of itself as a geopolitically neutral actor are the most dangerous thing in this equation, because that's the self-deluding element. I don't think the Russians are self-deluded in the way that the Europeans are, and I think the self-delusion that the EU exhibits in its Ukrainian policy it only functions as a result of the segmentation. And this goes back to the issue of where democracy lies and where sovereignty lies in the EU. Like the EU bureaucrats will quite credibly, and I think in good faith, insist they don't do geopolitics, because they really don't. But it's just that the government of Poland does, and the government of Sweden does. And by way of the multi-tiered structure of the EU, Carl Bildt and his counterparts in the Baltics and Poland can pursue small state geopolitics by way of the leverage of the EU and its neighbourhood policy, which is explicitly directed towards containing Russia. And they'll be completely frank about the fact that they are. And the Russians don't misunderstand anything about this. What puzzles them is that Berlin and Paris aren't willing to put their foot down and say, we're going this way or we're going that way. And Berlin and Paris are extraordinarily sort of indecisive in their approach. So that, for me, is the constellation. I wouldn't read it in terms of if you buy in. I think the danger of buying into your distinction is that then it is precisely the clarity of the distinction. The sense that a politics which was based on values or something would by itself be less unstable. And that isn't because I'm a conservative and favour great power politics as a more stabilising mechanism. It's because I just think that construction of great power politics allows those who advocate a values-based policy, which I would, to be naive about their own power logics. And that's what we can't afford in dealing with the Russians. So that's the tension. But it is really shocking how far up the European power pyramid this belief in the Russian conspiracy goes, and how sincerely those ideas appear to be held.
In the US too, right? I mean, like in the US too, right?
Yeah.
Context in the last couple of weeks.
Well, you summarized everything so well, and I want to, to get a little bit more of your opinions about. Okay, we convened here and debating now these terms. Of course, maybe one can just be content that we are talking about the same thing, and we have different terms. Okay, the backlash, some circles. Okay, liberalism, Trumpism, more, or other agendas. Populism, right-wing, and then, populism or right-wing populism, by the way, I was inclusive, but nobody hinted on that. If you then weight them relatively, with, advantages and disadvantages for the purely academic purposes, what is your summary of the day?
Purely.
For our analytical purposes as historians.
Whether or not populism is
Yes, the populism, within this field of terms, let's say, right, the old one fact of the terminological field.
Well, I thought the conversation,
But
I thought the conversation.
I want to, arouse more explicit opinion. Because I'm interested in.
Well, I thought the conversation we had with our political science colleague this morning was really useful.
Yes.
And I like the five-fold distinction we ended up with. The distinction between political structure, policy, constituency, ideology, and then, as it were, the historicity of the term of populism itself. That seemed to me that's as useful a kind of taxonomy as I've encountered so far. It is also multidimensional, and so permits of there's a huge amount of latitude there, many degrees of freedom in deciding, defining one way as opposed to another. I personally just think we should avoid the term because it's, as far as possible, because it's not obvious to me that it's got so many different potential, it has those 5 degrees of complexity, let's put it that way, and one of them is that it is a term of political combat, and particularly, and this goes to your insistence, and I like it in particular, the populists are not us. By us, I mean academics, like educated. That's the one thing that surely it isn't, and that makes me suspicious, and why we, in particular, should not use it, because it's kind of inescapably, when somebody with my tone of voice and my accent and my social position uses that term, there is no doubt that it has a kind of labeling and othering effect, and I don't think I think that's an unhelpful situation to find oneself in for purposes of both communication and for thinking. It so easily allows also whatever you say to be reinscribed into that conversation. I mean, that for me was the horror of this media circus I was sucked up into, in which whatever I'd written, I was being asked to speak and pronounce on this theme to find around that term, and so I think that would be my answer to that question. I in more general terms, I was really struck by the way in which we all converged on insisting. These was perhaps most explicit in terms of like these deep histories in which we can sort of soften the sense of shock, because these multifaceted processes are much more deep-seated. And
if we go into the deep history, then we would be drawn into, let's say, either historical parallels, which is of course done all the time, right? Which is a very dangerous terrain. And when I went on my book tour after the Trump victory, at one convention I heard, Hitler, Mussolini, was Trump. Eventually somebody at last mentioned Berlusconi, but it was kind of mind-body. Okay, so there's this difficult business of parallelization with earlier periods, or another way of thought might be, kind of long-term, let's call them maybe, precursors. Of course, living in Vienna, several come to my mind, and the most obvious one would be the turn of the century, the Lueger, the Christian socialists. So in other words, and then a tradition in even the much more democratic Czech society. There you have the so-called national socialists, not to be exchanged, of course, the national socialists also existed. And okay, so you would have this, tradition of political thought, of mass mobilization, of ethno-nationalism, and it fits pretty well. And I think this is also one of the reasons why this resurfaced in Austria, for example, or and in Italy. I mean, when you go to places where they like the Lega, very often they have either a picture or some, citation of Mussolini. And if you go to Austria and you go and meet FPÖ supporters in the countryside, they have an 80% bet that somebody who has their first name Horst, Hermann, or something Germanic and not Christian, that is the genealogy in the family. So you could bet on that. So there is this Christian, or well, it's a National Socialist, right? Then turning into real, sometimes it was something fascist. That doesn't mean National Socialist necessarily. Could be Nazi, but not necessarily. And then surviving somewhere through the post-war era in various, boxes. I don't know, maybe the trade union movement a little bit, maybe, the Christian wing of the conservatives a little bit, maybe in, the far right box, some of them, and then, the resurface. So that would be then the, long-term genealogy and tradition. And I like you outlined with Brazilian. I found it very compelling, They've had the 20 years and, the military regime. And then, however, after a long statement, the question is that how to label the whole thing. Again, okay, populism, all right, I agree with you. I would be very careful. You're in line with Charles by the way, in saying that. So what then, in view of the genealogy, and what could historians then, what could they do about all that? And where would be the American? They should construct the genealogy, should be, I don't know, as historians, should we construct the genealogy or refrain from it, condense it to post-Reaganomics. I'm not sure what to do with that. So if we say no, populism.
Yeah, maybe that's a good moment to open it up. I mean, sort of on a big terminological question about whether we have these two. Yeah.
Adam has written so much about it. Where to put it? And what can we do as historians?
Yeah, so just because are you asking what is the actual label that ties the phenomenon together? Not
Yes.
populism, that's your question,
Yes,
right?
in front of the background of this genealogy.
Yeah. I don't have an answer for this, but if there, and I'm not defending the analogy. The analogy is all wrong, but I remember when I was in graduate school, I studied with a professor, Henry Ashby Turner, who insisted there was not really fascism, but there was National Socialism, there was fascism, there were different things. So a phenomenon that in some ways had an obvious link, certainly chronologically. The field, I think, probably did well to disambiguate and to call different things in some senses.
Yeah, I mean, personally, my feeling about it is what Adam used the word flattening, and that's my big concern with that rubric, that it's just so stretches so far, it becomes so meaningless in terms of what you can actually put under it, because there's so many distinctions that is, I mean, not that it's meaningless, there are some, we identify those core elements, but I still think that the thickness of what comes underneath that is often so different that, that's why I think that I agree that I have a problem with this sort of overarching, all-encompassing, like that is this kind of thing, versus sort of understanding the kind of long kind of moments of crisis. I like that 1.0, 2.0 actually. I don't think, is that in your book or is that like something you just came up with now? Yeah, I kind of like that. I actually really like it a lot. As a differential of 2008 versus this like longer crisis. And is that result in this kind of role? Populism to me is just, it's flattening somehow. I don't know.
I mean, it strikes me that in the American context, anyway, that deploying populism usefully gets stuck between two discourses about populism. One that grows out of the New Left as an attempt to come up with a language for radical democracy that speaks American, right? It's the Lawrence Goodwin, Christopher
Jim Hightower.
Yeah, right. Harry Boyle, like this kind of, on the one hand, is this way, you know, we want to come up with a version of radical democracy that's not Marxist. It doesn't have that Marxist version. And then on the other hand, there's this version that's born from austerity, right? Populism is people telling you you can have things you can't actually have, right? And that it is used as a way to collapse right and left-wing protests against globalization or whatever. I feel like maybe there's still some kind of analytical value in between those two fields. On the one hand, the phrase "the emptiness of democracy," this sense that in some ways can be inflected in a right or a left-wing way, that popular government is in deep decline. Right? I mean, when we think about the era of neoliberal governance, right, it's also an era of deep political polarization, many crucial elections being decided by a few percentage points. For the American context, you know, this almost obsessive focus on the courts as a means of turning back legislation you don't like. Investigations, right? Every time the opposition party is out of power, you start launching investigations. And the
Focus on the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I mean, the sense of populism as the protest politics against that, right? The sense that we are going to restore populism. And I don't think that makes it coextensive with all, say, right-wing authoritarianism in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, right? But that there is a subset that takes that form and in some ways crisscrosses with other kinds of left-wing practice.
But I don't have any problem at all in specific contexts in which there is precisely the kind of configuration that you talk about in mobilizing, in the same way as Barbara was saying earlier on. In Latin America and the Spanish-speaking world in particular, it has a particular function, and so for Podemos to invoke that kind of language and to draw on its theoreticians seems to me an absolutely obvious move. And if you had some, if we had some sort of agrarian mobilization in the United States, one could see why, and furthermore then as social scientists, inverted commas, like we have a narrative of how we would make sense of that. We understand the dynamics of heavily indebted agrarian communities in the late 19th century. Like those things cohere. Nor would I, as I started by saying, I think at this point we have to take the discourse of populism, whether we like it or not, whether we want to employ it. Like I felt its force. They wouldn't let me talk about anything else. It's a thing out there, right? So, and I think it's quite an interesting thing because it does create this global comparability of politics. Like it's rather an interesting phenomenon that the American president should be so easily aligned with all these other people. And that's kind of novel. So at that level, I think it's interesting too. Like, will you ever find me using it? Personally, no, for the reasons, but that's irrelevant. Like, I completely agree. It could have all of those uses.
But before it becomes like just a soup, but like a useless kind of concept, why not make I'm supposing what the right wing does. If you're gonna, you have to decide why you call it, what is populism, right? Because at the moment, I think we sort of said this earlier, the only people who are not considered to be populists are these kind of career politicians, this kind of elite, what do you call it, consensus. Everybody else who demands more from democracy is a populist. If you are not going to include this kind of what seems to be a good thing, a more radical idea what democracy can be, then don't include that under populism. But if you want this thing to be useful, and then only decide, I'm being sort of very selective now, you have to come up with some kind of definition, and then you only call what the right does. If you want to stick and if you want to decide on populism, otherwise just leave it and find something else, find another idea, because you have to include what the left does. If you take its real meaning about the people, the mandate of the people, this obsession with it, then you have to include what the left does in it too, and then it doesn't. I don't think that it doesn't mean much. It's not very helpful in the concept. So either you decide that you mean by populism you're talking about the right, or you find something else. Because otherwise I think you're just endorsing, not us, but like one endorses this idea that the only people who are doing politics that is not populism
Yeah, right, so it's,
was like Bill Clinton.
it's a delegitimizing tool.
Yeah, yeah.
And arguably they're doing anti-politics. actually.
Yeah, they said that. They also said that.
Yeah.
They kind of say that. Sorry for not being helpful.
I'm really preoccupied with this question of history that Philip raised and that we were talking about over lunch as well, and the dimensions of history within which it came also out of the exchange with Helmut earlier on about Fourier, like the dimensions of history in which democracies flourishing or crisis of thought. I think that's a really fascinating dimension of this whole debate. When I said we should need to do deep history, I think I regret it as a sort of slip of the tongue. Because when I said deep, I really meant it's like back to the 1970s, 1960s, which isn't obviously. But I actually think it's really, I think that might be an interesting way of trying to diagnose our current moment. Like, what are the horizons of time over which different types of politics are being thought? And this goes back to your question about if Clinton had been elected and Brexit hadn't won, we would have just sailed on through. And instead, 2016 has become the annus horribilis, right? But then you can take this a little bit further. Like if you take the rhetoric of the Trump campaign seriously, right? It's indicating a sense of a kind of crisis time that is really dramatic, like American carnage, the speech he gave at the convention that summer, and then I quote it in the book because it so struck me. The next day, Obama comes out and gives this press conference where he says, "No, the birds are chirping. It's a summer day in America. It's the summer of 2016. Nothing is wrong. Kids are taking, parents are
Well,
taking."
that's certainly closer to the truth than American carnage.
But it also expresses a disjuncture, right, between, at the time that's what I thought, in retrospect it's like, you bloody complacent fools, focus, the crazy people are going to win, stop taking your kids to the swimming pool for 4 months and try and win this election, right? That the carnage people won, right?
Carnage wins every time.
And that to me is really also coming out of again the sort of extreme periods that Helmut and I spent too long on in the early 20th century, like those dimensions of disjuncture between normality and how normality is defined and what an alternative politics might be invoking, and the radical dimension it brings in, are very interesting, and they're interesting also because they bend back reflexively, because I'm thinking as a historian now, they bend back reflexively on us, because what is the narrative frame within which we position our current crisis, which is why I'm so insistent on trying to do this salami slicing job on everything since 1989, because if you've never allowed there to have been a moment where everything was okay, right, that is another way of doing the Obama move. No, it's not carnage, and no, it's not a sunny day, it's the usual shit show, right? And that seems to me a more stable point of view, right? Facing the usual shit show, rather than imagining some It's Morning in America of a liberal variety, or RoboCop, which is, I think, the world that Trump inhabits, 1980s urban crisis.
But then it's interesting to think. If the Democrats had gotten up in the early '80s, in 1980, and while Reagan was saying, it's morning in America, and we're going to make everything, and the Democrats got up and said, no, everything's a pile of shit, they would have lost just the same, So just, in a sense, it's not just that carnage always wins. Carnage coming out of the mouth of someone like Donald Trump always wins, but carnage coming out of the mouth of Hillary Clinton would not have won.
And then we're back to and how did he win? Did he really win? Who did he win with? He didn't really win very much.
No.
All he needed to But in any case, this dimension of temporality, of historicity, of the narratives that are both our mode of. This is where we again kind of slide into a weird symbiotic relationship with the thing that we're trying to study, because and this is for Rosanne Ballon and Fourier the crucial thing, right? Don't slip into the revolutionary time. Don't allow yourself to inhabit the space of the revolutionaries like Fourier did, tell the story of how they actually even imagined it was a revolution, right? That's this one removed kind of position. And I was saying to Lisa, one of the things as a European that just freaks me out about American politics across 95% of the political spectrum is rorty. no, what is it called? Fulfilling the promise of. This is like the founding of the 18th century is still something which now we're going to fulfill. Like, you know, achieving the promise.
Achieving the promise.
Achieving the promise. Like,
It's even older, it's biblical, right?
Yeah.
That's the Sermon on the Mount that comes from biblical laws.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, it's even older than the late 18th century.
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, that's a secularized version.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
You know, when you talk about, you know, what are the horizons of time, I mean, probably half the room is thinking about Kozelik, right? I don't know if, when I was going to discuss this, but one central point about Kozelik is that when you observe a phenomenon, you ask very centrally the question of how it relates past to present to future, how these temporal dimensions are brought together. And it does seem to me that, now, I don't know this in anywhere like the numbers of contexts that have been addressed here, but it does seem that while there's a certain lip service to the past, there is not a kind of engagement with the past which I would call deep.
By
I
who?
don't-
What are you talking, by who? By who?
Well, by what we are agreeing not to call populists. So when I think about, so the context I know best is the German context, and there, the AfD propagates a kind of longue durée light. You know, it's just, we want to have our history back, but geez, please don't look at it too closely. And in a way, I think that the American right has become a little bit like this too. There's a lot of talk with respect to the Supreme Court about, you know, honoring the founding intentions, but there's not a lot of thinking about what those intentions could be. So that's like one dimension of that, of the temporality. But another one, which is fairly central in the German case, are these future projections, like what is the imagined future that the people we don't call populists bring to the table. And here we really are at doomsday land. I mean, it really is, for the German populists, it's really this image that in the year 2100, there are only 20 million indigenous Germans left, and there are 35 million Muslims, and you know, some crossovers make up the rest. And from a perspective of a we, you know, sort of welfare state chauvinism, that's a real doomsday scenario. And then some of them, like one of the prominent ones, Sarrazin, even went further, did the math all the way down to, you know, 2300, no, not 30, what, 2300. And, right? What millennia are we in? And, you know, so at the end of that, it's like 6% Germans in Germany. And so there's this, I know, it's just crazy nutsy stuff, but there is a catastrophe scenario out there, and it's pretty central to at least some of the more radical thinkers of the extreme right.
But not as big a catastrophe as the warming of the planet and
Yeah.
life becoming non-viable in large portions of the world. So it's like pick your
They say have more babies.
Yeah.
They say that the other day in Congress.
Half our cities.
Yeah, have more babies.
And some of them explicitly draw the link, like Marine Le Pen actually has talked about how that's the reason they need to build Fortress Zero, right? Because that's why the refugees are already coming in, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not, I'm just pointing out, that's not necessarily very good.
Yeah, but these are also cases where a term like kind of racialized ethno-nationalism would get closer to the phenomenon, and the risk there of conflating racialized ethno-nationalism with populism is that it does the traditional work of attributing racism to lower class, more emotionalized, ruralized sectors, right? So it does a kind of the technocratic work of exonerating, the self-exonerating about kind of the elite structures of racism, right? And so there's a way that I feel like the stakes are really high in terms of how we identify, you know, these kind of specific politics, right? Because exactly what you described, the kind of racial demographic terror, is one that often gets kind of bend in the populist, right? But it's also a very elite formation, right? And it has, you know, a century of science and state policy behind it, right? And all of these non-populist instrumentalities. So,
wouldn't this, in a certain sense, explain, in a way, the breakage that you kind of chalked up to being contingent? That you actually really had like a theory of populism, right? That there's the demos, they got kind of tricked into being in favor of liberalism for a while, but at least screwed up. Now the demos has been settled, right? And Mario pushed you and that became contingency, but I was kind of thinking about it, and one of the things is like, you could say that there's a story about, like, degeneration of elites, like the elites.
Well, this is Perry Anderson's kind of take, right? And I was going to ask that. I mean, Bolsonaro's a moron, as far as I can tell.
Oh, yeah, no, he's and has appointed equally moronic people to key positions.
And in, you know, in relation to the Trump administration, we have to reckon with this fact, right? And I think it's just difficult to know like how one casts that as itself a theory which isn't reductive, like the degeneration of the elites within, you know. But Perry Anderson has turned that into a narrative mode. That's what gives the force to so many of his essays. Is this vituperative, more essentially, he himself is utterly patrician, and he has, you know, he perfected the de Orban kind of style, and no one is safe. And it's compelling up to a point, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, because I believe that you tried to kind of downplay the degree to which immigration was necessarily kind of the origins of populism. But given what you're saying,
the root cause.
The root cause. But given what you're saying, isn't it precisely the case? We kind of marry this with that. Isn't it kind of the case that like Islamic immigrants present an enemy who precisely can't be demonized in a way that authorizes internationalist liberalism? That creates like a fundamental problem.
So the fact that this is, as opposed to an enemy which does.
Yeah.
So an enemy.
Like communism.
Yeah, exactly. No, I like that. I find that the America needs an enemy to legitimate global hegemony. Then communism worked, and the war on terror just really hasn't.
That's the reason the Syrians were important, because they were literally coming here, but they were also Muslims, so we finally got Muslim immigrants, and that was perfect for the Donald, right?
Yeah. It was perfect for the...
For the Donald, he needed that. He's searching for an enemy, right?
Well, the numbers of Syrians who...
Yeah, it was tiny, but that doesn't that kind of give you wouldn't that give I mean, it is a populism argument, right? Like, but doesn't that actually give it like a causal impetus within the kind of theory you've articulated?
But it also then points to the thing that Lisa and I were, you know, tussling with, which is that it does, I agree, allow you to consolidate a xenophobic, anti-Islamic coalition. You can then layer anti-Latino prejudice, anti-black prejudice, and you can add that on top, and you've got yourself quite a collection. But it has no obvious systemic imperative, right? So it's kind of a wild card in terms of its ability to actually systematically articulate elite interest. It's not as though anyone's going to be expropriated, you know.
Isn't that your argument?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. Yeah, I don't have any problem with this sort of, and this will be true in the German case as well, that Merkel was clinging on. And then this sort of perfect storm argument arose, which is part in the Snyder version of events, is the deliberate project of Putin's grand strategy, right? You start the bombing in Syria so as to accelerate the flow of migrants, so as to present the CDU with a perfect storm that they can't control, which spawns the AfD.
So did you leave Yale last week college with Tim Snyder?
Yeah. You're uncomfortably close to the truth. Uncomfortably close.
Okay, I hit this point I don't expect. Well,
let's just say I have incredibly congenial colleagues at Columbia, as you will not be surprised to hear. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that, sort of going back to the issue of war and violence, and one of the things that I think is, I'm sorry always to go back to the case of Brazil, but it's the one I can talk about most credibly. There was a perfect opportunity right after his big electoral victory, taking office, for Bolsonaro to ally with Colombia, which also Ivan Duque is very right-wing, and invade Venezuela. That would have been, and he didn't do it, and I don't think he's going to do it. And I think partly it's because his military doesn't want to do it. His military is not, and one of the things that's an interesting wrinkle on all this, which goes to the sort of transnational character of these regimes, not these nations, but nations really, but these regimes, is he's very pro-American. He loves Trump, but his military is not necessarily pro-American and doesn't. I mean, I think they're indifferent. I don't think they think about Trump. They think about the U.S. And so, despite all his aggressiveness in his language, I don't think he's going to be making formal war on anybody anytime soon. He'll kill a lot of Brazilian citizens, or he'll be responsible for the killing of a lot of Brazilian citizens, but he won't be making war.
Which is why I think Erdogan is such an interesting case, because he has several live wars. I mean, the one in Syria and the one in Kurdistan, and the military whose internal politics is incredibly complicated. And Erdogan, I think, is and in an East Mediterranean strategic environment where he made the wrong bet in the Arab Spring, and the hope of completing the hypothesis that his party was Christian democracy, and that he was then also going to be able to turn the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt into, as it were, the grateful clients of his. I mean, he's playing for incredibly high stakes with all of the different tools of power. There are very few other. I mean, Putin is similar, but he's not really genuinely subject to electoral check in the way that Erdogan is. So he's a really fascinating example. To just go back to this exchange, that for me is also, how far. I'm scathing about Snyder's interpretation of this, but I do think that in the current conversation about refugees, racism, this phenomenon of democratic crisis, the way in which in Europe in particular we think the refugee crisis is this exogenous wild card, as opposed to a systemic effect of the disaster of American geopolitics, supported of course by the British in the Western Asian hemisphere, and the Mediterranean effects of the crisis of 2008 and subsequent, is crucial, because insofar as it's neither of those things, insofar as it's just a local disturbance amongst Arabs and Muslims, which then has a sort of shockwave effect on Europe, which European politicians then have to figure out, right? It's then the racism and cultural element, which in our efforts to decipher is an exogenous variable. Right? Whereas if you think of this as the long-term effect of the post-colonial situation, the failure of the EU to fashion a more constructive relationship with its Mediterranean environment, and the extraordinary cynicism of Europe's relationship with the Libyan regime, for instance, then it becomes fully endogenous, right? And the failure, as it were, of dealing with the refugee crisis goes back to the 2000s, not to the immediate moment of 2015. And it's a failure of Franco-German diplomacy, because the French and the Germans can't get on the same page about Mediterranean policy. And these endless tiresome debates amongst electoral sociologists about whether the people in Thuringia are voting on the basis of their long-term unemployment or on the basis of their hatred of Muslims, and which are two radically separate elements, and which confront dear old Merkel with an insoluble problem that has ultimately to be attributed to Putin, right, are excluding that whole set of holistic determinations. One of the regrets I have about Crash is I did an East European thing, very much under the inspiration of Philip Ter, but I think a fully systematic account, and this is what I really began to regret in these endless conversations where people would say, well, isn't populism to do less with unemployment than the hatred of Islam? And I didn't have the chapters that I sort of wrote in the draft that would have actually endogenized that. And you then experience on your, a migrant life, your own body, the way in which this intellectual segmentation leaves you incapable of really answering that question. Because for the journalist, clearly, if it's anti-Islam, it's not the same as economics, and so they've got nothing to do with each other. And so your materialist explanation is completely specious. Right? As though, I mean, I think that's a big challenge, both intellectually and politically.
Actually, to jump in on the question of that question of sort of making migration exogenous to the equation. I mean, I think there's another occasion where taking the timeline further back, right? Because that's also a condition of colonial and post-colonial migration, right? The desire to sort of, that part of the kind of decolonizing of the kind of hegemonic countries in the global north is about forgetting the kind of moral political obligations and sort of reciprocities and interconnections that came with a colonial, imperial, and post-imperial situation, right? And so the kind of moral economies can be contained within an inclusive, increasingly exclusionary nationalist frame, in part by externalizing the violence, right, and the kinds of consequences of violence and displacement that came from that imperial condition.
Which is why reading Stuart Hall was such a tonic, because they actually nail it. I mean, that book is so brilliant on the entanglement between Jamaica in the 1970s, the upheavals in Jamaica at the time, the Vietnam syndrome. I mean, if you haven't read it or recently read it, read it now, because I basically want somebody to write that book for the moral crisis of 2016, 2017. It's astonishingly. I mean, it's part of that Paul Gilroy moment. There's no black in Union Jack. That entire 1970s and early 80s moment is, I think, really generative right now. So, yeah, really, policing the crisis is staggeringly interesting, because it moves out from the newspaper discourse about mugging to its multiple determinations in the way that one wishes. And maybe Herb's book, you begin to do this in your history of refugees, but the way one urgently wishes 2015, 2016 in Europe could have been understood.
Additional comments or questions? All right, well, I'm not going to make any attempt to sum up our deliberations today. That would be fruitless. And certainly the kind of idea of trying to tidy things up, I think, would impose an authoritarian populist rationality. Maybe all by acclamation decided that there was
Cherry.
Here's a word we haven't used at all: demagogic.
Right, that's true, right, exactly. This is what we found out today. So just in conclusion, I'd like to thank the presenters for the wonderful presentations and dialogue. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. And I hope we can continue this dialogue and deliberations over some snacks and afterwards. And let's keep this conversation going. Thank you.